Welcome back for another Midnight Mirage history lesson. Just want to greet the ladies and gentlemen, of course. So for this tape, I want you to grab a pen and a pad so you can record some of the terminology that I'm going to use, some of the names that we're going to use, and you can do your own further investigation into some of the things that we're going to learn in today's tape. The primary subject matter and the question we're going to be answering is, what is an American? What is an American? And we're also going to look into ethnicity and nationality. So the primary subject for this tape will be, what is an American? And we're going to look into the subject of ethnicity and nationality. All right. There are going to be four primary sources I'm coming from. We're going to do some reading, of course. The first source is America, a Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent, the book that I wrote myself. The second source is going to be The Negro Question Part 3, The Black Pentecost by Lee Cummings. The third source is going to be The Negro Question Part 4, The Missing Link by Lee Cummings. And the fourth source is going to be Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past, Volume 2, The Columbian Era by Red Silver Fox Thunderbird. So let's go through the sources one more time. America, a Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent. The Negro Question Part 3, The Black Pentecost. The Negro Question Part 4, The Missing Link, both by Lee Cummings. And the final book, Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past, Volume 2, The Columbian Era by Red Silver Fox Thunderbird. All right. So that good old question, what is an American? What we're going to do is start off with this illustration on the screen right here. And what we have is three pictures or three illustrations of ancient Floridian or ancient American kings. OK. So first we have one right here that's dated back to 1723. And you can see right here, we're going to zoom in, a picture of an Aboriginal American king of Florida. All right. Dated from 1723. Next, we're going to come to this Floridian king of North America, dated to the 19th century or the 1800s. All right. We see this dark skinned man, king of Florida, dated to the 1800s. And finally, we're going to come to this picture of the copper colored American that was obviously depicted in the, quote, Florida Constitution by John Ogleby in 1671. So we have a picture of a Floridian king or an American king. And this was recorded in the Florida Constitution by John Ogleby in 1671. So we have three pictures of American kings right here. All right. Here's one. Here's our second. And here's our third. All right. Now let's read the text that was recorded by some of the Spaniards in the late 1400s when they went on their voyages coming into North America. All right. Let's read what it says. Quote, "There was in the first a very large black Indian of an aspect very different from those who inhabit the interior of the country. The barbarians of the coast are black in this manner because the sun is warmer there than elsewhere, and because they are continually in the water, which is salt, for the land being dry and sterile, they are obliged to fish in order to subsist. When the Indian had approached the caravel near enough, he placed himself on the prow of his vessel. In a voice full of haughtiness, told the Spaniards, according to what the interpreter asserted, that the Spaniards were robbers. What did they come to seek upon the coast? And that they should leave it in haste. Otherwise, he would burn their brigantes and put them all to a miserable death. End quote. This was recorded in the History of Hernando de Soto in Florida by Bernard Ship, chapter 8, page 472 through 473. So when Hernando de Soto and some of the other Spaniards, the conquistadors, started to come into North America, come into what we call modern day Florida, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, up through the Gulf Coast, up through the Gulf of Mexico, they started to encounter a lot of the Aboriginal American kings that were ruling in the Southeast. And right here we have a written description. OK, so it says that there was a very large black Indian and he was the king of the Floridians. And long story short, through his interpreter, he told these Spaniards that you all are coming here as robbers. And if you don't quickly leave, we're going to kill all you all and put you through a miserable death. So what we got to understand is that a lot of the early descriptions of the American people were recorded by these, these early Spanish, French, English invaders, I'm going to call them, when they were trying to spy and get information to send back to their, respective countries in Europe, because they wanted to know more about the American people, the type of culture the people had. What did they do on an everyday, what was their everyday schedule like? What type of natural resources did they have access to? What type of foods were they eating? And most importantly, how did the people look? What type of languages were they speaking? OK, and a lot of this was recorded by these early explorers. Some of them may have been Italian, but your early ones were coming from the Spaniards and coming from the French. OK, now, in one of my earlier tapes, I've shown a picture of Hernando de Soto and some of the Spaniards that he was accompanied with, excuse me. And what we got to understand is that when these Europeans were coming here, they were an amalgamated people, meaning that some of the Spaniards were full-blooded Moorish people. Some of the Spaniards were mulattoes, meaning a mixture between a full-blooded Moorish person and a pale Caucasian. And some of them were full-blooded Caucasians. So you had three different types of Europeans coming here: full-blooded Moorish people, amalgamated mixed quote unquote people, and full-blooded pale Caucasian people. But most of the ones that were in leadership, most of the ones that were doing the interpreting for the nations of Europe, and most of the ones that were doing the, having the conversations and communicating with these Floridian kings or these American kings, it was the full-blooded Moorish ones. All right. When a lot of these full-blooded Moorish people came from Europe, some of them spoke Arabic and some of them spoke the ancient Canaanite Paleo-Hebrew language. And this allowed them to communicate with the American people, because in the Americas, especially here in North America and the Southeast, what we call the Eastern Seaboard, the people spoke an Algonquin language. Algonquin language, Algonquin. A lot of people may want to know, well, what language were the American tribes speaking? OK, they were speaking various dialects of the Algonquin language. All right. And when you decipher the Algonquin language, what you're going to find is a lot of remnant of the Paleo Hebrew ancient Canaanite language infused into it. OK, so the Algonquin language is not a language that, is just separate from the rest of the world. It stems from one of the ancient Shemitic languages. All right. And the various tribes here in North America, they spoke some of these various dialects. All right. So this is how they were able to communicate. If you look into some of the recordings of Christopher Columbus, he was accompanied by some of these Moorish navigators, and they spoke this ancient Paleo Hebrew language. And this is how they were able to correspond back and forth between the indigenous American people and the foreign European people. OK, now that's very, very important for you to remember as we go deeper into the tape, because we're answering the question, what is an American? And we're looking into the ethnicity and nationality of the American people. OK, Now, as far as ethnicity and nationality, and I've said this in prior takes before too, human beings are typically described and labeled based on ethnicity and nationality. And the ethnicity is typically used as an adjective, and the nationality is typically used as the noun. Okay. So in this situation, when I say the word Aboriginal American, when I say the word Indigenous American, or if I use the word Moorish American, I'm using the word Aboriginal, Moorish, and Indigenous as an ethnic term, as a term to help you understand the phenotype of the person and how their physical appearance may be. So when we say an Aboriginal, an Indigenous, or a Moorish person, this is helping you understand how the skin tones and the various skin shades were. This is helping you understand maybe how the nose structure and the cranial structure was. And it's also helping you understand the various hair textures that the people had. OK, so we're talking about Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, Moorish people. We're talking about all the various copper colored shades and tones that our people come in, from a very, very dark copper colored all the way to what we call today so-called red bone or a so-called light skinned person. So here in the Americas, prior to the arrival of the European, you had various shades of Aboriginal American people. All right. You have a lot of people out here that think, so-called light skinned, quote unquote, black people have gotten that physical look because of admixture with Caucasian people. And I'm here to tell you that that is not true. OK, that is not true. Our people have come in various, skin tones since the days of Adam or the early Aboriginal man and woman. All right. So what we're going to do right now is shift gears, and we're going to go to my book. And in chapter 2, called Life Before Columbus, we're going to do a brief investigation into this word America or American and what it means. All right. All right, let's read. Chapter 2, Life Before Columbus. We're going to just read a little bit. Much of America's history is also hidden in the created holiday we know as Thanksgiving. It tells us a story of a foreign people being assisted and guided in the ways of life by indigenous Americans. But with these foreigners came mayhem and the destruction of a once remarkable civilization. From COVID-19 to the death of George Floyd, life since the arrival of Columbus has been totally opposite of what once was. There was a time when you had to pay no bills and food was in abundance free of charge. A time when you weren't in constant fear because of the modern mainstream media. Even as your eyes gaze these words, the perpetrators of ignorance are on the edge of their seats, desperately cooking up new lies to keep Americans dumbed down. If we follow the breadcrumbs they leave behind, slowly but certainly, we can weave through the bogus lives meant to deceive us. The word American, according to Webster's 1828 dictionary, means, quote, a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America, end quote. Now let's read that definition one more time. The word American, according to Webster's 1828 dictionary, means, quote, a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America, end quote. So in the 1828 Webster Dictionary, the word American originally was applied to the various indigenous, Aboriginal, or Moorish tribes who were of a copper-colored complexion that were here prior to the arrival of the European. So when we say in Americans, we're talking about the indigenous people from North, Central, and South America. Us in North America, in the area that we call today the quote unquote United States, because North America also includes Canada. When you hear me use the term mainland North America, I'm talking about what we call the so-called United States or the so-called 51 states. All right. So an American has to be somebody that's indigenous to one of these three land masses: North America, meaning the mainland in Canada, Central America and the adjoining islands, and also South America. So that term American has to be somebody that has a blood lineage that is traced back to the various indigenous tribes in North, Central, and South America that were here prior to the arrival of the European. Okay. Now, when we start saying that, okay, mainland North America, but you had various tribes that were in mainland North America. So let's use myself, for example. My parents and my grandparents and my great grandparents all originate in modern day what we call Georgia and Alabama. OK, Georgia and Alabama. On my maternal side, my mother's side, the Aboriginal tribe is called the Hitchiti Creek or the Uchi Creek that were found in what we call today Southwest Georgia and the eastern part of so-called Alabama. OK, they're called the Hitchiti Creek and the Uchi Creek. All right. And they resided in that territory primarily. And, you know, my people are from the area that's known as Stewart County. And it was once called Hanatchee. OK, so that was the indigenous name. It was called Hanatchee before they changed it to Louisville. All right. So it's called Louisville, Georgia today. When a lot of the Europeans came, they changed the name from Hanatchee to Louisville. And the indigenous people there went by the name the Hitchiti Creek and the Uchi Creek. All right. So we've all heard of the Creek Indians. OK, but, you know, most of you all that may have people from Georgia and Alabama, the Creek, you know, the terminology in front of the word creek is going to depend on maybe where your people were from. So, you know, where mine were from in that area of Georgia, they're called the Hitchiti Creek or the Uchi Creek. But you had other Creek tribes that were across Alabama and that were across Georgia. And they were also split into two factions known as the Red Sticks and the White Sticks, depending on, you know, how those people decided to associate with the European. So, for example, a lot of the Aboriginal tribes in Georgia and Alabama that were against the invading Europeans, that wanted to keep their original traditional American cultures. They wanted to keep speaking the Algonquin language. They wanted to keep wearing the feathered crowns and the turbans and all the other things that we were doing here prior to foreigners showing up. Those people were actually labeled as the Red Stick faction. And for those Aboriginal tribes that wanted to amalgamate with the Europeans, they wanted to convert into Christianity. They wanted to start consuming pork and even changing their physical appearance. A lot of them, we would refer to them as the White Sticks. OK, so you have a Red Stick faction and a White Stick faction. All right. So when we saying, you know, an American, just using myself, I'm an American, Hitchiti Creek, Uchi Creek American. OK, so there is a certain ethnic lineage and a tribal lineage that most of us have that you'll be able to find out those names when you know, do your research, looking into the area where your parents and your grandparents and your great grandparents are from, researching the Aboriginal tribes in that area, researching the main creeks, the main rivers, the main water highways in that area, because a lot of the times we would name the river after the people. OK, so although we may have the creek, or we may have, for example, like where I grew up on the south side of Atlanta, we got, you know, what's called Flint River. But a lot of the times we would name these rivers and name these lakes and name these creeks, name these oceans after the people. OK, so just keep that in mind. So remember, before we move forward, human beings are described by their ethnicity and their nationality. They're not described by colors. So that means we're not, quote unquote, black people, because black is a color. It's not an ethnicity. It is not a nationality. And it doesn't denote any kind of cultural way to identify a people. OK, also, we're not, quote unquote, African Americans either, because so-called Africa is its own, we'll say, jurisdiction or continent or landmass. And America is its own jurisdiction, continent or landmass. So you can't be from both. You either are somebody that's indigenous to the landmass that we call, quote unquote, Africa, and you come from one of those various nations and tribes, or you are a person that's indigenous to the territory that we call America, and you're indigenous to one of those tribes. Now, let me say this before we move forward. Did you have certain Hamitic Canaanite people that were, probably voyaging to the Americas, and did some of them maybe mix with the Aboriginal people here? Yes, you did. Did you have certain Shemitic European people come here that may have been coming from Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Switzerland, the Dutch, some of the Huguenots, some of the Spaniards, wherever they may have been from, but they were a people of color and they were a Shemitic people? And did some of them come here and mix in with the Aboriginal Americans? Yes, they did. So what I want you to understand is that majority of our genetic pool, majority of our haplogroups, majority of our blood is coming from this indigenous American family. Do we have maybe a small admixture from some of the various Shemitic nations that were coming from Europa that married into the American families? Some of us may, but it's a very, very small percentage. And I'm also going to say this too. When it comes to our names, some of our first and last names, most of them have been anglicized. What do I mean by anglicized? Meaning that it was an original Paleo-Hebrew Algonquin name, but we may have changed some of our names to sound more English. Okay. So originally we had Paleo-Hebrew Algonquin names in terms to identify ourselves. But later on, these same terminologies that were Algonquin or indigenous American names were changed into European names. So like I said, like my people from my mother's hometown originally were the Hitchiti Creek from Hanaachi. But when the English came in and some of the Spaniards, when they came in, they changed it from Hanaachi and they called it Columbus, Georgia, or they called it Louisville, Georgia. Now, the term Georgia comes from George, King George, who was a European. He was a Moorish man, but nevertheless, he was a European. So that's why the land mass today, I don't really refer to it as Georgia, quote unquote, because that's not its original ancient name. All right. So understand that there's a difference between the indigenous American Algonquin name and the European names. All right. So I don't want you all to think that you all's last names may have come from some so-called Caucasian, quote unquote, slave master. A lot of that is a lying narrative. And also a lot of our last names may not come from some of these Moorish Europeans that were coming here as well. All right. So just keep that in mind. Let's move forward. Many students are told in history class the name America comes from the Italian explorer named Amerigo Vespucci. But this is far from the truth. The name America existed on this land long before the Europeans reached the coast of Atlantis. America was named by the descendants of Meru, and we clearly can see the consonants MR buried in the name. Now let's pause right here real quick. When you look in ancient, literature and some of the recordings of the past, you will see that term Atlantis used a lot. And there is a lot of mythology surrounding Atlantis, especially when you look at, the History Channel show, The Ancient Aliens. They like to talk about Atlantis a lot. And even in DC comic books, they created the character named Aquaman, and they say that he's from Atlantis. But whenever they show you Atlantis, they always show you this underground city or a civilization that has been, let's say, covered with water. All right. A part of that is talking about historically what we know of as the flood and how some of that destroyed a lot of the civilizations that were once in the Americas. And Atlantis also is just a code word for America itself. OK, so when you hear that word Atlantis, I want you to think about America. All right. And the adjoining islands of the Americas, because in the old world, in the ancient world, prior to the flood, during the antediluvian period, what we know of today as the North Atlantic Ocean and the South Atlantic Ocean, there was not as much of a vast separation from the American continents and the continents that we know of as so-called Africa and Europe. They were actually they were much closer at one point in time. So today, although it's miles and miles and miles and miles apart between, the coast of what we'll call the Carolinas and the coast of what we'll call Morocco, and so-called West Africa, and Spain, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. But in the past, they were once much closer. All right. Look into Armorica if you want some more of that information. It was called Ancient Armorica or Ancient Brittany. All right. So if any of you all have a homegirl or a sister, or if maybe you're a woman listening to this and you know a girl named Brittany or Brittany, the name Brittany or Brittany is actually an ancient Moorish name that derives back from ancient America and ancient Europa. All right. That's talking about the copper colored people of that region. Also, to that name, America did not come from the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci. That's one of the different lies and deception that was put out in the education system. So you heard me here. You heard me say in this sentence, America was named by the descendants of Meru, and we clearly can see the consonant MR buried in the name. Remember, I told you that the land masses, the continents, the civilizations, the rivers, they're named after the people. When we hear this word Meru, Meru, this is where we derive that word Moorish from. All right. And also the word America, that's spelled America. You hear the word Meru or Mary in the word America. Now, you have to also understand that we got to do a quick school lesson, but vowels are interchangeable. A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. So that means that any word that has an A, E, I, O, U or a Y in it, you can interchange those vowels in the word and it essentially will retain its original meaning. So the word America, America, that word Mary is also the word Meru. So when you hear historians rather, use the word Moor or Moorish, they're actually talking about Meru. And Meru is just another word for Eden. So most of us that are familiar with the biblical civilization or the biblical time of Eden, which is the earliest civilization of human history, which is the civilization created by the first indigenous man and woman and that first indigenous group of men and women of earth that we know of in Genesis as Adam and Eve. Eden is also another word for Meru. So when I say that the indigenous Americans are the descendants of Meru, what I'm saying is that the Aboriginal people of America descend from those who date back to the beginning of Earth history, the beginning of human history. All right. Recorded in the Bible as Adam and Eve and recorded as Eden. All right. I'm going to also say this, too. I'm not one that's under the belief that most biblical history took place in the so-called Middle East or the Far East. OK, so, modern day Palestine, modern day Israel, modern day Egypt. I'm not led to believe that most of the accounts in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, necessarily all took place in that region. And when we're talking about the dispersing or the spread or the scattering of the various Shemitic nations during the time of post-flood, after the three sons of Noah left the quote unquote ark, all the way down to the Assyrian captivity, down to the Babylonian captivity, down to the Greco-Roman captivity, and down to the Roman captivity, all the way down to what we know of as the Inquisition of Europe or the so-called Spanish Inquisition. All of these different events caused the Shemitic tribes to spread amongst and throughout the earth. OK, so understand that the original American people, they've been here since the beginning of time. And did you have various Shemitic Israelite tribes coming here to intermix with the Shemitic people who were here? Yes, you did. But understand that the mound cultures of North America, the pyramid cultures of Central America, the Yucatan, Guatemala, Venezuela, the pyramids of South America, This culture was created by the ancient Olmec people, aka ancient indigenous American people, the ancient Yucatan people. And these people descend from those from Eden, okay? The descendants of Adam and Eve, all right? Now, I know this is a lot of, different terminology we use, but just, do your best to keep up with me, all right? So let's read this real quick. The descendants of the Atlanteans became who we know of as the Incas, Mayas, Aztec, and other American autochthones. The step pyramid and mound civilizations in America are older than those found in Africa. The Atlantean Empire had a trade system and ruled the seas. For various reasons, different groups of Americans went over into what we call Europe and Africa during the times of Pangea. Pyramid masonry is an old American science and known by the custodians who preserved the knowledge from Meru. American builders of Memphis, Tennessee and Memphis, Egypt were using similar technology at one time, okay? Now, before we move to our next source, I want to read this last paragraph. When we visit the lessons of vowels, we know that they are interchangeable, where consonants usually remain constant. The letters A, E, I, O, U, and Y can be arranged however the user sees fit in conjunction with consonants for spelling. But the root consonants of the word will stay the same. The descendants of Meru or Eden are also known as Moors, quote unquote. In the word Moor, we see the E and the U in Meru have been switched for two of the letter O. This gives us the Meru American or the Edenic American or the Moorish American. Using Moorish as an adjective helps historians specify the autochthonous copper-colored American who descends from those who inhabited the cradle of civilization, Meru or Eden, okay? So I just wanted to go into, some of the origins of that word American, how the Aboriginal American descends from those who were in the time of Eden, and that in certain literature and in certain other books that you're going to read, the word Meru is another word for Eden, okay? So just keep that in mind. The next thing we're going to do is come in the book, The Negro Question Part 3, The Black Pentecost by Lee Cummings, because there is certain information that was recorded by European Caucasian explorers and European Caucasian writers and historians, and they're going to verify and back up a lot of what I'm saying. So they're going to give us a whole nother source that's verifying the same information, okay? This is coming from page 158. The source is the North American Review. It was released in 1815, okay? So it says, the North American View, volume 139, issue 334, actually was released, or maybe it was recorded in September of 1884. The title is called Our Remote Ancestry, page 246 through 256, written by author Alexander Winchell or Professor Alexander Winchell. And these collections or these journals are found in the North American Review from 1815 to 1900. So what we're about to read right now is coming from the North American Review, volume 139, issue 334, September of 1884. The title is called Our Remote Ancestry, pages 246 to 256, written by author or Professor Alexander Winchell, spell his name Professor Alexander Winchell, Winchell. And these collections or journals can be found in the North American Review, 1815 to 1900. So let's real quick look at what Professor Winchell wrote in his work. The North American Review, the foremost publication in England and the United States in the 1800s, had this to say about the black beginnings of Europe, quote unquote. Now, once again, we're using this word black in here, but we're talking about Aboriginal people, whether they be from Europe, America, etc. So if you hear that term Black American, they're talking about indigenous American. If you hear that term Black European, they're talking about an indigenous European. If you hear that term so-called Black African, they're talking about an indigenous person to the landmass that we call Africa. Now, this is a quote that was written by Professor Winchell in the 1800s. He says, quote, "The blacks came from Atlantis and northern Africa. They built cities in Spain, Sicily, Rome, Gaul, and Britain long before the sack of Troy." I'm gonna repeat that. He wrote, the quote, "Blacks came from Atlantis and northern Africa. They built cities in Spain, Sicily, Rome, Gaul, and Britain long before the sack of Troy." So what Professor Winchell has, written in his work is that the so-called black people or the Aboriginal people came from Atlantis and North Africa. So when he says Atlantis right here, I want to ask you a question. Now, if you look at Atlantis or the Atlantic today, all you're going to see is a vast ocean. Okay, you're going to see a vast ocean. So what you got to think about is this. Do you think that the people that came from Atlantis, he's talking about, just came out of the ocean like Aquaman and ended up in Europe and started creating civilization? Or did these people from Atlantis that he's talking about come from the Americas? I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about that. Now let's think about this one more time. He says the blacks came from Atlantis and northern Africa. They built cities in Spain, Sicily, Rome, Gaul, and Britain long before the sack of Troy. So what this gentleman has written in his information is that the copper-colored people or the so-called Negroid people that created the civilizations in Spain, Portugal, Sicily or Italy, Rome, Gaul, what we call modern day France and Germany, and Britain, known as the United Kingdom, that these people came from Atlantis and North Africa, meaning these people came from the Americas, and some of them came from Northwest Africa, so-called, or the Mediterranean, all right? So understand that the Aboriginal European is a mixture of Shemitic and Canaanite Phoenician, and these people came from the Americas. They came from Northwest Africa, and they came from various parts in the Mediterranean. Okay, very, very important ancient information. All right, and this was written by this man, Professor Winchell. So, when they talk about the so-called Moors in 711 going into Europe and civilizing Europe, not all of these Moorish people came from North Africa. Some of them came from the Americas too. This is something that is not talked about much. So they don't mind telling you about, the Moorish Islamic, empire that came from so-called Northwest Africa and started to, enter into Europa through the south. But they don't want to talk about the Meru indigenous American nation that also went into Europa and set up civilization as well. Because ethnically, these were the same people. Okay, ethnically, they were the same people. And I'm also going to say this too. We had our own version of Islam and Hebrew culture in the Americas prior to any European and prior to any Moorish people from Africa coming over here. Okay, so I'm not led to believe that the Paleo Hebrew culture we had and the various Islamic universities that we had, in the West, in what we call Mexico, Arizona, California, New Mexico, Nevada, the Islam and the Israelite culture that we had here in the Americas, goes back to the beginning of time. And many of our people were not converted into that by these foreign Europeans coming from so-called Europe and coming from so-called Africa either. All right. So just keep that in mind. So now we're going to go into our next source, The Negro Question Part 4 by the same author, Lee Cummings. All right. Now, what I wanted to do is we get in various sources where different authors, different historians are basically saying the same thing that I am. It's just we hearing it from different people. OK. Now, this is coming from page 4. Let's just read real quick. It says, now it's going to be various historians. I'm going to name the historian and then I'm going to quote what they wrote. All right. So the first one, Professor Winchell Alexander. We just read about him. Our Remote Ancestry, 1815 to 1900, collection of journals. And this is what he wrote, quote, these short black men came from Atlantis, Northern Africa, and they overran Europe. They were known as Britons. Next source, Roman historian Tacitus, Tacitus, The Origins of the Black Britons. Quote, the Iberians are black people with curly hair. Anthropological Review, Society, London, Volume 8. All right. So in this information, it says, quote, the Iberians are black people with curly hair. We're going to talk about what an Iberian is in a minute. The next source, Joseph Ritson. This is this man's name, Joseph Ritson, Ritson, Annals of Caledonian Picts and Scots, Volume 2, pages 7 and 27. So the next source is by Joseph Ritson, and it's called Annals of Caledonian Picts and Scots, Volume 2, page 7 and 27. Quote, the Picts/Brits are brown complexioned with curly hair, end quote. So that's what he wrote. He wrote that the Picts and the Brits are brown complexioned people with curly hair. The next source, Ivan van Sertiman, African Presence in Early Europe, page 225. He writes, quote, the Britons look like the Ethiopians, end quote. Next source, Albert Churchward, 1912. Origins and Evolution, page 12 and 13, quote, the Black Basque were exterminated from Europe, end quote. Next source, Professor Boyd Dawkins, Our Earliest Ancestors, Bygone Days, a lecture delivered in the Public Hall, Collyhurst, Manchester, January the 8th, 1879. And he writes, quote, the ancient Britons, Irish, Scots are a short black people. This can be found on page 103 to 107 in his work. Next source, Dr. Thurnham, Dr. Thurnham, Dr. Thurnham, Nature Journal of Science, page 92. He writes, quote, from the evidence at hand, it seems that the Iberian or black man occupied the whole Western Europe at one time, end quote. Next source, Professor Huxley, 1870, The Iberian Race, page 332, quote, the Iberian/Basque/Blacks bones have been found all over Europe with his animals, end quote. So let's read what the author wrote. I have inserted the writings of 8 English or 8 white pale Caucasian historians to show you that our white brothers who were closer to the epicenter didn't have a problem telling the truth about the original inhabitants of Europe. The Welshmen, Britain, Irishmen, Frenchmen, Russians, Germans, Italians, and Swedes were in Europe thousands of years before the English Caucasian arrived in 449 AD. And this will be proven by the writings of one Professor Boyd Dawkins, Professor of Geology at Manchester University, London. Professor Boyd Dawkins was invited to speak in the public hall in Manchester, London, January 18th, 1879. And in his lecture, he gives a detailed account of the people who originally inhabited Europe. And without blushing, this is what he said. So let's read what he said real quick. So this is Professor Boyd Dawkins, Professor of Geology, Manchester University, London, 1879. Our Remote History, pages 95 through 106. Quote, the original people of Britain, Spain, France, and England were short black men of about 5'6" in height. They were in England when our fathers, the white English, invaded the land in 449 AD. Our fathers were a warlike people who by 607 AD had pushed the Basque west into Wales, Cumberland, Westmoreland, the Highlands of Scotland, and Devon. These black people boasted that they were citizens of the Roman Empire. The Welsh or ancient Britons were in possession before the Romans ever came here. These black Basque/Britons have brought the knowledge of iron and bronze with them. The iron and bronze technology will be proven perfectly when I show you the German Tapestry. These people were herdsmen. They possessed the short horned ox, the horned sheep, the goat, pig, and the horse. Evidence of their civilization can be seen all over the continent of Europe, as well throughout the British Isles, extending as far as Germany and Switzerland, and even to France and Spain, end quote. These black people originated from Iberian Peninsula and are a fragment of the old Spanish population. They were in France, Spain, Ireland, Britain, and Scotland, end quote. So let's go through all this real quick. All right. So our first quote is Professor Winchell Alexander telling us that the short black men came from Atlantis in northern Africa and they overran Europe and they became known as the Britons. So the original people of Britain were a copper colored people. All right. And some of them came from the Americas. The Roman historian Tacitus, when he talks about the origins of the Black Britons, he writes, the Iberians are black people with curly hair. That term Iberian is another term for Eber or Heber or Hebrew. OK, so the term Iberian is another term for Eber or Hebrew. OK, so keep that in mind. You will hear that word Iberian a lot. The Iberian Peninsula, Eber, etc. OK, so also the Aboriginal American and the various tribes that our people come in. Historically and in literature, we also are referred to as Iberians. Why? Because we come from the same ethnic Shemitic family as these original Europeans that were creating those civilizations in the Mediterranean and also into Western Europe. Joseph Ritson writes, the Picts/Brits were brown complexion with curly hair. The Picts and the Scots, that's another word for the people of the United Kingdom. And as he wrote, they had a phenotype that was a copper colored complexion and they had a curly hair, the same as the indigenous American. All right. Ivan Sertiman in his work writes that the Britons look like Ethiopians. You'll see that word Ethiopian used a lot, not to describe the nation that the people come from, but their ethnicity and how they physically appeared. So the various copper colored skin tones, how the nose and the lips, the cranial structure, and the various, hair textures that so-called black people come in. Sometimes you will see the word Ethiopian used to describe our people. One of the Verrazano, who was one of the Italian explorers, when he came into Florida, Georgia, and the southeast woodlands of North America, he used that term Ethiopian to describe our people as well. OK, let's move forward. It says that the ancient Britons, Irish, and Scots were a short black people. OK, it also goes on to say that from the evidence at hand, it seems that the Iberian or the so-called black man occupied the whole Western Europe at one time. So there was a point in time during the time of ancient Brittany, the time of ancient Armorica, that the entire Western Europe, the Mediterranean, Northwest Africa, and the Americas was inhabited by the ancient Iberian or the so-called ancient black man and black woman. Okay? So we are the original people of these lands. All right. And as it says right here that the Caucasian Europeans who took on that name English, you know, the descendants of the Neanderthal, the wild man and the wild woman that came out of the caves of Asia Minor, once they started to go west into Europa, they destroyed a lot of what was known as the Byzantine Empire. And a lot of them also began to, you know, destroy a lot of the civilization that was in Western Europe. And also, let me say this. When they talk about the Black Plague of Europa in the 1300s, the 1400s, the 1500s, this plague was actually brought upon the Aboriginal people of Europe by the wild man and the wild woman who was coming out of the caves of Asia Minor. So the Black Plague did not spread by rats. If the Black Plague was on rats, it got on the rats because of the wild man and the wild woman, those Neanderthals that were coming out of the Caucasus Mountains. It traveled with them. It traveled in the lice, the body hair of the wild man and the wild woman when they came into Europe and also when they came into the Americas. So when they talk about these different diseases and viruses that destroyed a lot of the Aboriginal tribes and put a big dent in a lot of our population here, they talking about that same Black Plague that was coming from Europa. And a lot of our cousins that were in Europa died from this Black Plague. Okay. And the Black Plague was spread by the Neanderthal groups that were coming out of Asia Minor and coming out of the Caucasus Mountains. So that is another historical lie when they say that the Black Plague was spread by rats. That's not true. It was spread by the Neanderthal, the wild man and the wild woman, and all the body hair that they had and the lice that was still attached to their body hair because they were living in the caves. They had poor hygiene habits, and a lot of them would sleep with animals. OK, so when they started to encounter our people, although we don't have that type of body hair, the lice and these plagues, they were still able to, you know, attack us. And it did put a dent in a lot of our people. All right. So although today you have indigenous American people living with European Caucasian people, and, you know, we seem to not really have the problem with the Black Plague anymore. That's because our immune systems have become accustomed to a lot of the diseases. And we've created antibodies to fight a lot of those diseases that were coming from Europe that came with them. But our early ancestors that was here in the Americas in the 1400s, the 1500s, and the 1600s, when these Europeans came here, they were not able to fight off some of those diseases. And I'm going to also say this, too. When the Moorish Europeans came here, because they were affiliating and associated with those wild people of Europa, some of them were carrying the plague, too. And you got to remember that a lot of these diseases that transferred over to the people, some of these also were sexually transmitted diseases because we would intermix with some of the people that looked like us. All right. So early on, and even to this day, a lot of Aboriginal people or copper colored people are not too fond of sexually procreating with the Caucasian. OK, but for those that did do it, a lot of their numbers died out because of these various diseases that were, you know, transferred over to them. All right. Once again, this is not dealing with the racism, anything. We're just talking about history. So when you hear that term Iberian is talking about an ancient Shemitic person or a so-called black man or black woman. OK, keep that in mind. So the next thing we want to do is we want to look at some pictures real quick. And I want you to pay attention to this old picture of Virginia. All right. This is coming from one of my books, the cover of it. Real good picture. And I want you to pay attention right here. Now, what you see on the screen right here is a picture of two Aboriginal Americans in the landmass that we call Virginia and Florida, because on this map, You see the word Virginia and you see the word Florida. All right. Now, I showed you earlier the pictures of how the American Floridian kings looked. They were a copper colored people, a dark skinned people, dark skinned men. What you have on the screen right here are two Aboriginal Americans. And as you can see, they too are of a dark copper colored complexion, a dark mahogany brown complexion, because as I said, our people come in various skin tones and various shades. So whoever the author was that created this map of ancient Virginia and ancient Florida, they knew and recorded the Aboriginal people to look exactly how they saw them at that time period. And this is how they look. So these are the Iberian people of the Americas right here. If you are from the Americas, North America, mainland North America, this is how your ancestors looked in the 14, 15, 16, and 1700s. So they're not from so-called Africa, and all of them are not from so-called Europa. Remember, if the people you're from Europa came here and intermixed with the American tribes, the Americas was already full of millions of people when the Europeans got here. That's another thing. You can't be believing a lot of these bullshit lies when they try to tell you the populations and how many people were here, and even all the way up to today. Like today, they'll try to make you think that so-called black people are 13% of the United States population. I don't believe that, and I have never believed that. And honestly, we've been stuck on that number for quite some time. Now, because of the Canaanite child sacrifice rituals that we've been participating in since the early 1960s, when we, chose to get with the Democratic Party, the Ku Klux Klan, Margaret Sanger, and how a lot of them boule niggas signed us up for that. Because we've been aborting a lot of our, babies. Yes, that's put a dent in our number. But nevertheless, this continent was full of a lot of people. And I'm going to tell you this, too. The so-called black man, the Iberian man, the American man, we have the strongest procreative powers of all men in the world, meaning that we're the most fertile. It's the easiest for us to procreate. It's the easiest for us to create a lot of children. So can you only imagine how many children the American men had when the Europeans first arrived? And you also have to remember that a lot of the American men had multiple wives. So that means that they had multiple children from multiple women. When you read in the Old Testament, you will learn that Abraham had 2 wives. You will learn that Jacob/Israel had multiple wives and multiple maidservants that he had children with. You will learn about the prophet Samuel's father and how he had multiple wives, excuse me. So there was an ancient Shemitic practice and an ancient Hamitic practice where the Aboriginal man always had more than one woman and he procreated with more than one woman. So just taking all that, our numbers are way more than 13%. And when the Europeans and the foreigners got here, there were so many Aboriginal people here that a few of them may have intermarried into our families. But what would happen is we would absorb them into our culture. That's what was happening. We would absorb them into our culture. And then for those of us that were of a white stick faction, we would absorb them into our culture. But then we would start changing our names, practicing Christianity, and we would start practicing more of the European culture. OK, but nevertheless, majority of our ancestry comes from these Aboriginal American people who are already here. So if you were to do let's say a test on the different haplogroups that's in your blood, majority of it is going to be from the Aboriginal American. And you will have a certain percentage that may come from the Shemitic Europeans that came because they intermarried into our families. But just keep in mind that the majority of who you are and what you are is an American. And that's if you're a person that has parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents that are here from the Americas. Meaning that you don't know any other ancestors that are on the continent of Europe or on the continent of Africa or anywhere else. OK, so if you can't get on the phone and call a cousin, an auntie, an uncle, or a grandparent that's actually in Europe or Africa right now, then more than likely the bulk and the primary group that you come from are these indigenous American tribes. And it's just a fact. I got people that I know right now. I got certain Hamitic brothers that I know that I'm cool with. They can get on the phone right now and call aunties in West Africa right now. Certain brothers I know that may be from Europa. They can get on the phone right now and call their grandparents that still live in the United Kingdom. When Blackbeard gets on the phone to call his aunties and his grandparents and his cousins, you know where I got to call? I got to call the people that are in modern day Georgia, Alabama, and various parts of what we call North America. This is where my people are from. So I can't get on the phone and call anybody from Africa and Europe because that's not primarily where I'm from. All right. So here is a picture, once again, before we move forward, of how the Aboriginal people of Virginia, Florida, the Carolinas, Georgia, the Woodlands, the ancient Mississippian culture, the descendants of the ancient Yucatan culture, the descendants of the ancient people of Meru or Eden. This is them right here in the Americas. All right. Here is another good picture, all right, from a book that I'm about to read. As you can see, we have a picture of the various Aboriginal American people, all right? Now, let's just look real quick. You can see us wearing the turbans with the feathers, all right, wearing the crowns, dressed in our indigenous American attire, and you can see we're in various skin tones. So you right here on the right, you got two copper-colored brothers, look like they looking through some boxes and stuff like that. Behind them, you have another group of Aboriginal warriors right here, as you can see. And over here you have, kind of in the corner, he's hard to see, but you have a European Caucasian man. All right. More than likely that was, part of the journey. He probably came here with some of the Moorish Europeans. But this right here in the middle is very, very important. What you have right here on the top is an ancient Aboriginal American empress. OK, I believe this is a woman because it looked like, you can see breast on the chest. But as you can see, she's in a position of royalty and leadership and rulership. And she's being propped up by a pale Caucasian slave who is naked. So when I said that the Neanderthal wild man and wild woman, when they came from Europa, when they came out of the Caucasus Mountains, a lot of the Moorish tribes of Europa, the Celts, the British, the Irish, etc., they began to enslave and subjugate the Neanderthal tribes that were coming out of the Caucasus Mountains. So when you hear that term, a Slav, S-L-A-V, today when you get that term Slovenian, that comes from the word a Slav or the word slave or that term serf, like serfdom. So the term serf or slave actually originates with the pale Caucasian people of Europa that were put into servitude by the Europeans, the copper-colored black so-called Europeans. And that practice of so-called slavery or serfdom, a lot of our Moorish cousins from Northwest Africa that were Islamic, and a lot of our Moorish cousins that were from Europa, they brought that practice over here and they taught it to some of us. And then some of us got down with it. So we would purchase a lot of these Caucasian pale slaves or serfs from these Moorish Europeans and Islamic Moorish people when they came over here. And we would make them work on our plantations, on our tobacco farms, on our rice farms, etc. And here is an illustration of it right here. So this pale Caucasian man you see right here that's naked with the blonde hair and the blonde beard, he more than likely is a descendant from those Neanderthals that were cleaned up, shaved down, and were forced to work in the fields and forced to till the land and work the land by the Moorish Europeans. And when those Moorish Europeans came to the Americas, they did certain land deals with some of the Aboriginal tribes on the eastern seaboard. And, some of us began to engage in that slavery practice as well. OK, so, yes, the Aboriginal Americans learned the practice of slavery, from their Moorish, Islamic and Moorish Israelite cousins from Europa and Northwest Africa. And, we would put the people to work here too. I'm not saying that it's cool because I don't condone that. But we're just looking at history and getting an understanding of what's going on in this picture. And also, you can also see that, we would force some of our own people into work as well. So certain Hamitic tribes that was coming over here that were part of, those Spaniard conquistador Christian crusades, when we would destroy them, we would put them and force them into servitude. So a lot of what they talk about, the Hamitic or the so-called African slave trade, and, you have certain Hamitic tribes being forced into servitude here. A lot of them were actually forced into servitude because they were part of those conquistador, war parties that we would destroy. And those that would survive that we didn't kill, we would force them into servitude. So here in the Americas, you would have a copper-colored indigenous American king, and he may have a plantation, let's say in the Carolinas. And on his plantation, he has Hamitic Africans working, and he has pale Caucasians working. Okay? And that's what you see right here illustrated in this picture. And before we move forward, you have right here what we may call today a red bone or a so-called light-skinned Aboriginal American person. And as you can see, they have tattoos. That's another way you could identify the American tribes. A lot of our people would, wear tattoos. Now, is that against Shemitic Israelite culture? Yes, it is. But, that was one of the practices that the people did here. So even to this day, when you see a lot of the brothers, and they tend to tattoo themselves up, that is actually an ancient American tradition. All right. Now, I'm not telling you to run out and go get no tattoos if that's not something you already have and something you're already into. But, that is some of what the people did here. And you got to also remember, too, that just like in the New Testament, when Paul and the various apostles during the time of Christ, when they went into a lot of the various Gentile nations, and when I say Gentile nations, I'm meaning Shemitic Israelite people who are living in other places such as the Americas, the Mediterranean, certain parts of Asia Minor, and certain parts of Europa. A lot of us had forgotten our Shemitic Israelite culture. So, we would do things like sun worship and some of the other things you saw going on here in the Americas that was recorded by the Spanish explorers, the French explorers. They saw us here doing the sacrifice and stuff. They saw us doing the Moloch rituals here. You know what I'm saying? So in Mexico, in the Yucatan, Guatemala, the Spaniards, they did see us, doing those pulling the heart out ceremonies and stuff like that. Some of that was going on because that was still a remnant of that ancient Canaanite practice that our people had learned during the times of entering the promised land with Joshua and Caleb. OK, so just like how in the book of Numbers, when, Moses told the people that, look, when you all go into Canaan, you all are going to see some of the indigenous people practicing these, what we'll call pagan religions. But you should refrain from that. OK, so also remember that here in the Americas, you had, two type of religions. You had Aboriginal people here that was practicing, those ancient Canaanite religions, those ancient Hamitic religions, worshiping idols, doing sacrifices, etc. And then you had certain Aboriginal tribes that worshiped the one true God, the spiritual God, and they made no graven images of him. And a lot of that information was recorded by a man named James Adair, who was an English trader in the 1700s when he stayed with some of the Aboriginal tribes in the Southeast. OK, so James Adair noticed that a lot of the tribes in the Southeast had Israelite customs. Yes, Israelite customs. So, just like when Paul and the various apostles went into the various nations and they helped the Shemitic people understand what our true culture is, and how we originally practiced religion, some of the people start getting down with the new thing that they were supposed to be doing. And they left alone those pagan practices. They left alone the idolatry. So a lot of that occultism and that dark magic, that black magic that you saw practiced in, with the Haitians, brothers and sisters, some of the brothers and sisters in Louisiana and some of the other islands, those occult practices go back to ancient Canaan, because the Israelite Shemitic people did adopt those practices. Okay. So that just goes to show you that, why you see some of that in the Aztec culture or the Maya culture and the Floridian cultures. Why are some of the Aboriginal people doing sun worship? And that's the answer why. Okay. Now, what we have on the screen right here is an Aboriginal empress, an Aboriginal American empress by the name of Anacoana. All right. And as you can see, as we're going to zoom in on her, today she would be called a so-called a black woman. All right. So we're going to read about her a little bit and get an understanding of who she is and, her contribution to history. All right. Now I'm reading on page 39 in this book called Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past, Volume 2. Some of these Aboriginal names, these American names, they may be a little difficult for me to pronounce, but nevertheless, we're going to try it anyway. Among the persons who were being held for shipment to Spain were Keonabo, the principal chief of Maguana. He was accused by Chief Guacanagari of the destruction of La Navidad. Keonabo was a very powerful and respected chief and was considered the Spaniards' most formidable enemy. He was angry that visitors had invaded the island and built a fort in his dominion without his consent. He was also infuriated that the Spaniards had demanded a tribute from his people, and even more, he was incensed of the cruel and savage behavior of the colonizers, and he wanted them off the island. So what was happening is that a lot of the Aboriginal kings and empresses, and really a lot of the people that was giving the Spaniards problems, they would try to capture them, of course, separate them from the tribes, kill them. And a lot of them, they would send them into servitude and force them, and really like use them as like courtyard jesters and take them back over to Spain and stuff like that. Okay. So I want to right now get to the history of this empress. All right. All right. So remember, this chief named Keonabo. Matter of fact, you know what? We're gonna read all of it. Excuse me. All right, Keonabo. Keonabo, along with other principal chiefs of the island, devised a plan to get rid of the Spaniards from Hispaniola. When the Spaniards received word of the plot through Guanagari, they concocted a plan to capture Keonabo. The Spaniards were hell-bent at bringing Chief Keonabo to justice for the destruction of La Navidad. So ultimately what was happening is Emperor Keonabo, once he saw these Spaniards coming into the island of Hispaniola, he said, nah, we're going to war with them. We fucking they shit up and we're going to do our best to get them out of here. Eventually what happened was the Spaniards arranged a fake meeting with Keonabo and his villagers. He was presented with numerous gifts, among them some shining handcuffs. Keonabo was fascinated with shiny objects, so he was immediately drawn to them. The Spaniards told him he should try them on, and Keonabo obliged. Once the handcuffs were secure, the Spaniards took custody of him and carried him back to their ships, where he was held captive until the ships sailed back to Spain. He, however, never made it back to Spain. He died along the way. So that was another thing, too. They used to use a lot of deception and try to like soften our people up because we were so brutal and so aggressive that they had to use a lot of alternate ways to kind of, take the land and stuff like that. And really, we lost a lot of the land because you had certain Aboriginal tribes who were sellouts, certain chiefs who were jealous of other chiefs and they would turn into snitches and rats. And also a lot of the pale Mongoloid Siberian tribes that they call today so-called Native Americans, which were another ethnic group that were here. a lot of these Europeans would team up with them to fight against us too. Okay. So now let's read about Keonoba's wife named Anacoana, which is the woman that you see on the screen right here. Okay. All right. So basically it says, Anacoana and her chiefs were assembled in a house where Ovanda was staying, which looked over the square where the show would take place, while the rest of the people of Zaragua watched from a short distance. So what happened is that the wife of this emperor, once he died and was captured, she basically took on his task to keep going to war with the Spaniards and to fight against them with her brother and some other people. Okay. And of course, they gave them a hard time. And it was a well fought war. But, some of the people were captured. All right. It goes on to say, several of the people escaped from the massacre and fled into their canoes. They were pursued, taken, and condemned to slavery. Anacoana was taken in chains to Saint Domingo, where a mock trial was given, and she was found guilty by the testimonies that were coerced and tortured from her chiefs. She was then hung in front of her survivors. So this woman right here is an American empress, really a war hero, somebody that we should, salute. And basically she took up that fight after her husband was, killed. And she continued to go to war with these Spaniards until eventually, a lot of people was ratting out in the tribe. A lot of these war chiefs was caught and tortured, and they started giving up information on her. And basically, her group was disbanded, and she was taken into, captivity, and they put her on trial. And then eventually she was hung and put to death. Let's keep going. Her memory is still celebrated today, 5 centuries after her hanging. She is remembered not only as a leader of her people, she is known for the ballads, songs, and poetry she created. An 18th century poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson, even wrote a poem about her, which he never published, giving various unconvincing reasons, but perhaps providing the real reason in an unguarded comment describing, quote, that black bitch Anacoana and her cocoa shadowed covers of niggers. I cannot have her strolling about the land in this way. It is neither good for her reputation nor mine, end quote. Apparently, writing a positive poem about a black person in the 1800s was taboo. But even more than that, it would reveal that the people of the islands were of a Negroid stock. So this individual named, this poet in the 18th century or the 1700s named Alfred Lord Tennyson, he wrote a poem about Anacoana and her people. And this is how he described her. He called her, quote, that black bitch Anacoana and her cocoa shadowed covers of niggers. I cannot have her strolling about the land in this way. It is neither good for her reputation nor mine. And it's saying that right here that he didn't more than likely want to publish this because it will reveal that the people of the island were of a Negroid stock. And by this time, they were already starting to put out the lies about who the real inhabitants of the Americas was. OK, so in this information, Anacoana is described as a, quote, black bitch. And she's called a nigger along with all the people in her war party. So let me ask you this. Why would they call this woman a black bitch and a nigger if that's not what she physically and ethnically appeared to be? OK, so just like Pocahontas, or who they call Mataoka, the Empress of the Powhatans, Anacoana is also of a Negroid stock and an Aboriginal woman, an Iberian woman, OK, an American woman. All right. And she's described. And the reason why we know she's an American, a true American, Aboriginal American, because these Europeans called her a black bitch and they called her a nigger. Isn't that the same thing that they call so-called black people today? Don't they call the black woman a so-called black bitch? Don't they call so-called black people niggers? So if Anacaona was described as a, quote, black bitch and a nigger, that meant that she had to have been a maternal or a female ancestor of today's so-called blacks. And they're also saying she was of a so-called Negroid stock. So the people of Hispaniola that wasn't, approached by the Spaniards in the 1500s, they were described as being black bitches and niggers. All right. There's only one group of people that are described that on this continent today, and we call them so-called blacks or so-called African Americans. All right. So we're going to wrap up this tape by basically giving a salute and a shout out to the Moorish, the Meru, the Edenic, the American Empress, the Hispaniola Empress, Anacaona, which is her on the screen, the Golden Flower, a woman of war, okay, and a woman that wanted to fight to defend her people, and a woman also that fought to defend her husband's honor, all right? So if any of you women out there listening to this tape and you're ever wondering, like, well, who are some of the ancient American women and empresses that fought, for their people? Here's one of them right here. Her name is spelled Anacaona, Anacaona. OK, Anacaona. I may have been saying Anacaona, but Anacaona, just like the word anaconda. OK, like the anaconda, which is what? An indigenous American snake, right? It's one of the largest snakes in the world. So the name Anacaona and the word anaconda, they all derive from that same root, that same American ancient Algonquin root. All right. So that's why that serpent, that's only indigenous to the Americas, because anacondas are not found in no other continent. That's why that animal is one of the symbols of ancient America, as well as the Floridian alligator. So the Floridian alligator and the American anaconda, these are ancient symbols or ancient, what they call zoo types of the ancient American. And they represent, of course, the strength and the power and the ferociousness of the warriors here and how we fought. And a lot of the time you will see ancient American warriors adorn themselves or cover themselves in serpent or anaconda or snake skin, as well as alligator skin. So when you see, these women today and they have the snake skin purses or the snake skin dresses and outfits and shoes, or the alligator purses and the alligator outfits, that is an ancient American attire. OK, and that's something that we would do here. All right. So hopefully you all learned a lot about this tape. You all stay tuned for the next one. And of course, I'm out.